The syringe felt heavy in her hand, a small weapon filled with nothing more than a vitamin cocktail. This was just a job. A private nursing gig inside a Brooklyn brownstone, paying a salary that could pull her family from the edge of a cliff they had been dangling from for years. Her light blue scrubs, crisp and clean, felt like a costume in the oppressive silence of the house. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish, old leather, and something else, something metallic and cold that clung to the back of her throat. This was the world she thought she was entering. A world of quiet wealth and professional care. But the man in the wheelchair was not just a patient. She had been warned he was difficult, a recluse since his accident. She had not been warned about the sheer, suffocating force of his presence. He had not turned from the armored glass window since she entered the room 10 minutes ago. All she could see was the rigid line of his shoulders beneath a dark cashmere sweater and the back of his head, his black hair cut short and severe. The wheelchair was a throne of black metal and leather, its technology gleaming under the recessed lighting. And when he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble of gravel and disuse. "Get out." Audrey's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She looked toward the door, where two men in dark suits stood like statues. They had not moved. Their eyes were fixed forward. She was not being dismissed. She was being tested. She drew a steadying breath, her fingers tightening on the syringe. "My name is Audrey. The agency sent me to administer your evening medications and begin your physical therapy regimen." He finally turned the chair with a soft, electric whir. The movement was jarringly smooth, a contrast to the man it carried. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, a sculpture carved from unforgiving stone. A pale, thin scar cut from his left temple to the edge of his jaw, a stark white line against olive skin. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of burnt coffee, and they were utterly, terrifyingly still. They held no flicker of pain or self-pity. They held only absolute, chilling authority. "I am aware of what the agency sent," he said, his voice flat. "And I am telling you to leave." "My shift is 12 hours, Mr. Volpe," Audrey said, her own voice steadier than she felt. She was 18, her certification barely 6 months old, but she had learned on the chaotic floors of a city hospital that you never let them see you sweat. "I was hired to provide care. I can't do that from the hallway." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even surprise, passed through his eyes. He wheeled himself closer, stopping only a few feet from her. The air crackled. He was assessing her, his gaze sweeping over her from the worn soles of her comfortable shoes to the soft, round curves of her body, lingering for a moment on her face. She felt pinned, a specimen under a microscope. Most people were unnerved by his stillness, his silence. They would fill it with nervous chatter. Audrey met his gaze and waited. He gestured with his chin toward a crystal glass of water on the table beside him. With a deliberate, almost graceful movement of his hand, he knocked it over. Water cascaded onto the polished hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. It was a test, a petty act of dominance meant to make her scurry and fuss. Audrey did not flinch. She placed the syringe on a sterile tray, walked to the en-suite bathroom, and returned with a thick towel. She knelt, the fabric of her scrubs pulling tight across her thighs, and methodically soaked up the spill. She did not rush. She did not sigh. She simply did the job, her movements efficient and devoid of emotion. When she was finished, she stood, disposed of the wet towel in a hamper, and picked up the syringe again. She looked at him. "Are you ready for your injection, or would you like to break something else first?" For the first time, a shadow of something other than contempt moved in his face. It was not a smile. It was the barest hint of a concession, a grudging acknowledgement. He was Nico Volpe. In his world, people did not speak to him this way. They begged, they stammered, they obeyed. This girl, this soft, young nurse in her pale blue uniform, had looked him in the eye and refused to be rattled. "Fine," he said. The word clipped. He held out his arm, the cashmere sleeve pushed back to reveal a corded forearm. "Stay. But you will regret it." As she swabbed his skin with an alcohol wipe, the cool, clinical smell a small comfort, she heard the click of the lock on the study door. It was not a sound of privacy. It was the sound of a cage being secured. She had thought this was just a job, a difficult patient in a fancy house. But as she administered the injection with a steady hand, she understood that the salary was not for nursing. It was for surviving him, and she could not afford to fail. The days that followed fell into a rigid, suffocating routine. Morning, vital signs, medication, bathing, and dressing. The intimacy of the tasks was a sterile, one-sided affair. Audrey moved with a practiced detachment, her hands gentle but firm as she tended to a body that was a paradox of strength and helplessness. Nico's upper body was powerful, his shoulders and arms thick with muscle from propelling himself and from the grueling therapy he endured. From the waist down, he was still, his legs unresponsive, a constant, bitter reminder of the life that had been stolen from him. He spoke to her only in commands. "The water is too hot, lower the shades, leave." She responded only with professional courtesy. "Yes, Mr. Volpe, of course, Mr. Volpe." She never called him Nico. He never used her name. To him, she was an object, a pair of hands. To her, he was a puzzle of controlled rage and profound loss. The afternoons were for physical therapy. These were the worst hours. In the large, empty ballroom on the second floor, converted into a state-of-the-art gym, she would guide him through the exercises, stretching his unresponsive limbs to maintain flexibility, strapping him into braces that held him upright between parallel bars. His frustration was a palpable force in the room. He would grip the bars, his knuckles white, sweat beading on his brow as he tried to command his body to obey. Again, he would grind out, his jaw tight with effort. "Your muscles need to rest, Mr. Volpe," she would say calmly, monitoring his heart rate. I said again. One afternoon, his legs spasmed, a violent, uncontrolled jerk that nearly sent him toppling. She moved instantly, her body bracing his, her arms wrapping around his torso to keep him upright. For a moment, they were pressed together, her soft curves against his hard, unyielding frame. She could feel the furious pounding of his heart, smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and soap on his skin. He was rigid in her arms, his breath hissing through his teeth in a sound of pure humiliation. "Get your hands off me," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. She did not let go. "You'll fall," she said, her voice quiet but firm, right beside his ear. "Breathe. Just breathe." He froze. He was used to being obeyed. He was not used to being held. After a long, tense moment, he slowly relaxed against her, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a weary bitterness. She helped him back into the chair, her movements careful. The silence that followed was different. It was not angry. It was heavy with something new, something unspoken that neither of them was ready to name. She was not just a nurse. In this house, she was a ghost, moving through rooms where secrets were whispered. She saw men with hard eyes and expensive suits come and go, their conversations dropping to a hush when she passed. She saw his underboss, a lean, watchful man named Marco, present ledgers that Nico would review with an unnerving focus. She learned to read the temperature of the house. Some days were calm. On others, a tense energy vibrated through the walls, and Nico's temper would be a razor's edge. One evening, Marco found her in the kitchen, preparing Nico's dinner tray. He leaned against the steel counter, his expression unreadable. "He is not an easy man," Marco said, his voice quiet. "I'm aware," Audrey replied, not looking up from slicing vegetables. "The agency will find you another post. A better one. No one would blame you for leaving, it was an offer. A way out." She knew what he was really saying. This place was dangerous. The longer she stayed, the more she would see, and the harder it would be to walk away. She thought of her mother's exhausted face, of the eviction notice taped to their apartment door. She thought of the flicker of raw pain she had seen in Nico's eyes that afternoon in the gym, the agony of a predator trapped in a broken body. She had come here for the money. That was the truth. But another truth was taking root, one she was not ready to examine too closely. "The accident," she said, changing the subject. "Was it an accident?" Marco's face hardened. He looked at her for a long moment, a silent debate in his eyes. He had seen her with Nico. He had seen her quiet competence, her refusal to be broken. He made a decision. "No," he said softly. "It was not an accident. A rival family. The Falcones. They ran his car, off the Verrazzano." He was not the only one in the car. Marco's gaze drifted toward the window. His younger brother, Dante, was with him. Dante did not survive. The knife stilled in Audrey's hand. Suddenly, Nico's rage was not just the frustration of a paralyzed man. It was grief. It was guilt. It was the fury of a king who had failed to protect his own blood.
Dante.
A name for the ghost that haunted this silent house. Audrey finished arranging the food on the tray. She picked it up and turned to Marco, her expression set. "Mr. Volpe is my patient," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Marco nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He had offered her an escape, and she had refused it. Therefore, she was no longer just the nurse. By choosing to stay, by knowing what she now knew, she had stepped over a line. She was part of this world now, whether she knew it or not. And its dangers were now her own. The knowledge of the Falcones and of Dante changed the texture of the silence between her and Nico. She saw him differently now. When he stared out the window for hours, she no longer saw a man brooding over his own condition. She saw a man replaying a nightmare, a brother mourning a ghost. Her care took on a new dimension, a quiet compassion that she tried to hide beneath her professional veneer. She did not mention Dante. She did not offer platitudes. Instead, she made sure his coffee was just the way he liked it. She found a recording of an old opera he had once mentioned and played it softly during his therapy. Small things. Almost unnoticeable. But he noticed. He began to speak her name. It was rare and always abrupt.
Audrey.
The file on the desk. Audrey. Closed the door, but hearing it in his low voice sent a strange shiver through her. He said it differently than anyone else. He said it like it was an object he owned. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the library. It was the one room he never used, a place thick with the dust of disuse. She ran her fingers over leather-bound books, the titles and languages she could not read. A large, ornate desk dominated the room, and on it sat a single, closed ledger. It was different from the financial books Marco brought him. This one was bound in dark, unmarked leather. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in this house, won. Her heart hammering, she opened it. It was not a journal. It was a list. Names, followed by dates. Some of the names had a single, neat line drawn through them. A cold dread washed over her. She knew, with absolute certainty, what she was looking at. This was not a record of debts paid. This was a record of lives taken. This was the accounting of his revenge. The soft whir of the wheelchair behind her made her jump, a gasp escaping her lips. She spun around, her hand still on the open ledger. Nico was there in the doorway, his face cast in shadow. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He just watched her, his expression a blank, terrifying mask. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He could have her removed. He could have her silenced forever. She had seen the truth of who he was, the cold, brutal calculus of his power. Her mind raced, searching for an excuse, a lie. But her throat was dry, her words gone. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the ledger. She did not try to hide it. She slid it back to its original position in the center of the desk. Her hands were shaking, but she met his gaze. She did not look away. In that moment, she crossed a line. By not running, by not screaming, by her simple act of putting the book back, she had become an accessory. Her silence was her confession. She knew, and she was not afraid. Or rather, her fear was secondary to something else, something deeper that was growing between them in the shadows of this violent world. He wheeled himself into the room, stopping directly in front of her. He was so close, she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He lifted a hand, and she flinched, expecting a blow. But his fingers were surprisingly gentle as they brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a spark in the suffocating tension. "You are not afraid of me," he stated. It was not a question. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. It was the truest thing she had ever said. His eyes searched hers, looking for something she could not name. The moment was broken by the shrill ring of his private phone. He dropped his hand. The spell shattered. He answered, his voice once again flat and cold. He listened for a long moment, his entire body going rigid. "Where?" he bit out. He listened again, and a darkness she had never seen before flooded his face. It was not anger. It was a lethal, focused rage that chilled her to the bone. He ended the call, without another word. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his control. She saw a flicker of something that looked like fear. Not for himself. For her. "That was Marco," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Someone broke into your family's apartment." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. "They didn't take anything. They just left a message. On your sister's pillow." Audrey's blood ran cold. She pictured her small apartment, her mother, her 12-year-old sister, sleeping. A message. The Falcons. They hadn't come for him. They had come for her. She had thought her choice to stay was her own risk to take. But now, the consequences of her complicity, of her proximity to Nico Volpe, were bleeding into her world, staining it with a terror she had never imagined. Her morally gray choices had a cost, and her family was being forced to pay the price. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Audrey. Her sister. The image of her small, sleeping form and a dead thing on her pillow was a visceral horror. Her first instinct was to run, to get to them, to pull them out of the life she had dragged them into. "I have to go," she said, her voice a choked whisper. She turned toward the door, her mind a frantic blur. "You will go nowhere." Nico's voice cut through her panic, sharp as broken glass. He had already moved his chair, blocking the doorway. "Running to them now only confirms you are my weakness. It puts a bigger target on their backs." "They're my family," she cried, the professional facade crumbling to reveal the terrified 18-year-old beneath. "This is my fault." "Yes," he said, his tone brutal and devoid of pity. "It is your fault. You stayed. Now you will deal with the consequences." He looked past her, at the two guards who had materialized silently in the hall. "Marco is already on his way. He will move your mother and sister to a secure location. They will be protected." The words were a lifeline, but they were also a chain. Protected by his men. Kept in his world. She sank onto the edge of the desk, her head in her hands. She had traded her family's safety for a paycheck, and now their freedom was the price. Nico watched her, his expression unreadable. The cold fury from the phone call had settled into a grim, focused resolve. This was a move against him, through her. An insult that could not be ignored. For the Falcons, it was a test of his power. They believed a man in a wheelchair, a man in mourning, was a man who could be broken. Over the next 2 days, the house became a fortress under siege. More guards appeared, their presence a constant, silent threat. Marco reported that her family was secure, moved to a nondescript apartment in a building Nico's family owned, with men watching it around the clock. Audrey spoke to her mother on a secure phone, the conversation stilted and strange. She tried to sound normal, but the lie was a heavy weight in her throat. Nico was a man transformed. He spent hours on the phone, his voice a low, commanding murmur. He met with his capos in the study, the door firmly closed. Audrey was shut out, relegated back to the role of nurse, but the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. When she tended to him now, there was a new tension. He was aware of her not as staff, but as the axis on which this war was turning. On the third night, he called her into the study. The room was dark, save for a single lamp on his desk. He had a map of the city spread out before him. "I have called for a sit-down," he said without preamble. "With Matteo Falcone." Audrey's stomach clenched. "A sit-down? You mean a meeting?" "It is a formality," Nico said, his eyes on the map. He will not honor it. He will see it as an opportunity. A man in my position, meeting him on neutral ground. He will see it as a chance to finish what he started on the bridge. It's a trap, she whispered. You're using yourself as bait. It is the only way to draw him out. To end this, he finally looked up at her, his gaze intense. Tomorrow night. A closed restaurant in Red Hook. She knew what she had to do. The thought terrified her, but the alternative, waiting here while he rolled into an ambush, was unbearable. I'm going with you. He gave a short, harsh laugh. Do not be ridiculous. They targeted me to get to you, she argued, her voice gaining strength. They know about me. If you show up without the nurse who is always with you, they'll know something is wrong. They'll know it's a trap. My presence is your camouflage. He stared at her a long, silent appraisal. She was right. Her argument was tactical, logical. It was the kind of reasoning he understood. In his world, loyalty was a weapon, and presence was a statement. Her being there, this soft, ordinary girl, would be the most disarming part of his arsenal. You will do exactly as I say, he said finally, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will not speak. You will not move. You will stand behind my chair. Am I understood? Yes, she breathed, relief and terror warring within her. The restaurant was cold, the air smelling of stale wine and fear. It was a long, narrow room, tables covered in white cloths like ghosts. Nico was positioned at the head of a long table, his back to a solid wall. Audrey stood behind his wheelchair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her nurse's kit, usually a source of comfort and purpose, felt useless here. Marco and two other men stood near the exits, their stillness more menacing than any overt threat. Matteo Falcone arrived with 4 of his own men. He was older than Nico, with silver hair and a smile that did not reach his cold, reptilian eyes. He feigned surprise at seeing Audrey. Nico, you bring your nurse to a business meeting? He said, his voice oozing false cordiality. Are you so unwell? She goes where I go, Nico replied, his voice flat. A precaution. The lie was smooth, believable. They sat. The air grew thick, the pretense of negotiation a thin veil over the violence simmering just beneath the surface. Audrey focused on Nico's shoulders, on the solid, unmoving line of his back. She counted the seconds in her head, her breath shallow. The signal was a word. Nico said, Dante. The room exploded. Marco had his weapon out before Falcone's men could even react. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space. Audrey screamed, dropping to the floor behind Nico's chair as he pulled a handgun from a holster strapped to the chair's frame. He was not a helpless target. He was a predator, and this was his hunting ground. A Falcone soldier, flanking them, took aim at Nico's exposed side. Marco was pinned down. There was no time. Acting on pure instinct, Audrey shoved a heavy, wheeled serving cart with all her might. It careened into the soldier, crashing into his legs. He stumbled, his shot going wide, shattering a mirror on the wall. In that split second of distraction, Marco fired twice. The man fell. The fight was over in less than a minute. 2 of Falcone's men were dead, the other 2 wounded. Matteo Falcone himself had a gun to his head, held by a grimly silent Marco. Nico looked at the fallen soldier, then at the serving cart, then at Audrey, who was crouched on the floor, trembling, her eyes wide with shock. She had not just been a witness. She had acted. She had saved him. In the aftermath, the silence of the ride back to the brownstone was absolute. Marco was in another car, getting a wound on his arm stitched by a private doctor. Matteo Falcone was gone, his fate sealed. Audrey sat in the study, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though she could not stop shaking. Nico wheeled himself in front of her. He did not speak for a long time. He simply watched her, his expression a complex mixture of things she could not decipher. They saw you as a weakness, he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. A vulnerability. They were wrong, he paused, his gaze unwavering. You are a fortress, Audrey. He reached out, not to her cheek this time, but for her hand. His fingers, cool and strong, closed around hers, lacing through them. It was not a gentle touch. It was a claim. In my world, debts are paid, he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. You saved my life. That is a debt that can never be fully repaid. But I will try, he held her gaze, the authority in his eyes absolute, but now it was laced with something else. Something possessive.
Something permanent.
You are mine now. Your family is under my protection. You will have anything you want. You will be safe. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But you will not leave. She looked at their joined hands, the contrast of his scarred, powerful one and her soft, trembling one. This was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of ownership. A life sentence in a gilded cage. He was her patient, her captor, the source of all her fear and the architect of her safety. She thought of the terror of the past few days and the strange, fierce rightness of shoving that cart, of acting to protect him. Slowly, she turned her hand over and squeezed his fingers back. It was not a surrender. It was a choice. Her choice. In the silence of the room, with the city's sirens a distant lullaby, she had found her place in his world. And she would not be leaving.